Hey everybody, Mike here with Delta Faucet. If you're planning a bathroom renovation or even doing new construction, a steam shower can make all the difference in elevating your showering experience, and it's a project we can help you tackle. Now in this video, we'll be running through the installation steps for the Delta SteamScape Classic System. Now keep in mind that building codes are different everywhere. For the scale and components of this project, you will need a licensed electrician and a licensed plumber. Also, you will need to make sure you have a 208 or 240 volt circuit available, as well as a nearby water supply stop. Now, before we get started, we want to make sure you're watching the right video. Take a look at your installation booklet or package and confirm what steam system you selected. This video will cover the Delta SteamScape Classic System. Now, if you selected a different Delta Steam product, don't worry, we have other videos for you. Also, we want to make sure you have purchased all of the required components. This includes the control and steam head package, as well as the SteamScape generator. In this video, I will also be installing the optional generator pan and auto drain. It is important to note, while these are not required components, they are definitely recommended for some additional peace of mind. Before we get started, there are a few things we should also discuss. First, the shower area or steam room needs to be completely enclosed to retain the steam. Your walls and your ceiling need to be tiled, insulated, and waterproofed. Your shower door also needs to have a continuous seal with your enclosure. However, a small gap at the bottom of the door of about an inch is recommended to allow for a little bit of airflow. Okay, with all that out of the way, let's get started. So the first steps in our installation happen during the rough framing phase, which you can see that we're in here. What we want to do is think through how you're going to utilize your steam shower once everything's completed. In my enclosure, you'll notice that I have my main showering components on the side wall here, and I'm going to be installing a seat on the opposite wall, which is where I'll probably be sitting when I operate the steam shower. So the first thing we think about is where we want to locate our steam head. Now, generally speaking, I want the steam head as far away from me when I'm in that seated position because steam is hot, so I'm going to locate it on that far wall. Also, I want to make sure that that steam head isn't going to be located directly below any of my other showering components because steam rises and could cause those components to become hot to the touch. Finally, I also make sure that steam head is about 12 to 18 inches off of my finished floor, and also think through any of these steam head trims you're going to be selecting, making sure that when we get to that installation part, it's not going to be too close to the corner or anything else that could cause an issue when you install that trim. All right, once we have that steam head located, we can move on to locating our control panel. Now, there's a few things to remember here. First and foremost, we want to make sure that the control panel is inside of our enclosure. Secondly, we also want to make sure that the control panel is far enough away from our steam head and our other showering components to ensure an accurate temperature reading. And finally, again, thinking through how you're going to utilize the steam shower, want to make sure that it's in a spot that's going to be accessible to you when you're actually using the steam shower. So again, for my instance here, I'm going to be on the side wall, sitting down, so I want to make sure it's within arm's reach. Now I'm going to install it on my back wall, just above this horizontal shelf I have here. Now generally, we like to see the steam control mounted about 48 inches off of the finished floor. However, use your best judgment for your application at home. I like to double check the location of my control panel and also my steam head one last time to make sure it's not going to interfere with any of the finished decisions I'm making for my enclosure, such as tile or something similar. Once you're happy with these locations, we can move on to selecting the location of our generator. Next, we can move on to determining where you want to install your steam generator. Now, I have mine dry fit here so I can kind of show you how it's all going to look, and I'm inside of a closet on a wall that backs up to my shower enclosure. However, the unit can be installed in a closet or in an insulated attic or basement or even inside of a vanity. There's a few things that are important to remember when we select the location though. First, we need to make sure that the unit is going to be accessible. And it's a great idea to double check your installation booklet for all of the minimum clearance requirements around the unit itself to make sure we're meeting all of those based on the one you've selected. Secondly, we need to make sure that the unit and the length of the steam pipe that's going to connect the steam head inside of the enclosure to the unit itself is going to be 50 feet or less. Also, we want to make sure that the control cable that's going to connect the unit to the control panel inside of our enclosure is going to be 70 feet or less. Now keep in mind that 35 feet of cable is shipped with your unit, but Delta does offer an extension of an additional 35 feet if it's required for your application. Now, once you're happy with the location you've selected, we can move on to having your licensed electrician and your licensed plumber finish out the roughing requirements for this installation. First, for the electrician, you'll notice that they've supplied a dedicated wire that goes back from the breaker box to my generator location based on the specs dictated within the installation booklet for the unit I selected. And also, they've run a conduit for my control cable at a location just above my generator spot all the way back inside my enclosure so I can run that control cable to connect the control panel to the generator once we have the sheetrock and all the tile in the finished enclosure all done. Now for my plumber, they provided me with a cold water supply line just over my generator location here. And also they've completed the 3/4 inch copper line that connects my steam head inside the enclosure to a spot just off the edge of the generator like so. Now a few things about this line is first, we want to make sure that the steam line is pitched either slightly back towards the generator or slightly towards the enclosure itself, because this will help prevent any condensation from sitting inside the line. Secondly, if your line is over 10 feet, it should be insulated with the appropriate heat-rated insulation. Now, I think it's a great idea to go ahead and insulate that line no matter how long or short it is, because it will help ensure the most efficient operation of your unit. My plumber has also added a drain at this location because I'm going to be installing the optional generator drain pan and auto drain for this installation. However, even if you aren't installing those two optional components, it's still a great idea to have a drain at this location because it will help make maintenance that much easier, and it also may be required by code. So, once you're happy with your generator location, we can have your licensed electrician and plumber come in, finish up in the roughing requirements, and then we'll move on to the next step of the installation. All right, so here we are in our finished space, so we can move on to installing our steam generator. But before we do that, I want to point out a few things that my electrician and plumber have completed. First off, the electrician has provided us with a disconnect and some additional conduit to make our final electrical connections, and also has made sure that they helped us pull the control cable that goes from our control panel inside the shower back here where it will connect to the steam generator. My plumber completed our supply line and also has completed the drain in the floor. So the next step is basically dry fitting our unit in the final install location to make sure everything looks like it's going to fit correctly. So again, for my install, I'm going to be using the optional generator drain pan, so I'm going to start with that, placing it in the corner here, followed by my generator. All right, I want to make sure that generator is relatively centered on my pan, and I'm going to check for a few things before I verify this installation location. The first is I want to double check to make sure I have all my minimum clearance requirements around the unit specified in my installation book, and I also need to make sure that this is being installed on a flat and level surface. Once everything looks good, I just want to double check to make sure that I've thought through how my pan and any of my drain lines from the front of the generator are going to drain into my floor drain. Next, I double check my electrical, making sure that my conduit has plenty of slack to make my final electrical connection, and also that my control cable has enough slack to connect into the back of the unit like so. Now for my plumbing, I just want to double check to make sure that my supply line is going to connect correctly to the top of my generator, which it looks like it will. And then also double check to make sure that my steam line coming out of the wall is relatively in line with the steam output of my steam generator. Now when my plumber makes his final connection, they're going to include a union between these 2 points. And basically what that's going to do is make it easy to remove the unit if we ever need to do any maintenance or replace it for any reason. Also, I want to think through how my pressure relief valve here is going to drain. In this case, I'm going to go straight down into my drain pan, but I could also come off the end and go into my floor drain if I needed to. And if you remember, I'm also going to be installing the optional auto drain. Now, there's a few things I want to talk about with the auto drain before we get to installing it. The first thing is you'll see on the bottom, there's a little word flow with a black arrow, and we want to make sure that arrow is pointing away from the steam generator. Next, it's going to be installing down at the bottom port of my steam generator here, like so. And finally, I want to make sure that any additional piping I have coming off the back of my auto drain is pitched slightly away from my generator because the way this drains is using gravity, so we want to make sure the water is running away from the steam generator. And if you look on the back of the auto drain, you'll see that there is this little lever that needs to be in the open position for the duration of the install. Once our plumber's made all of the final connections, we can come back and make sure that this lever has been moved to the closed position. Okay, with all that in mind and everything looks great, I'm going to go ahead and have my electrician and my plumber come back in to make those final connections, and they'll be ready to move on and see how everything looks once it's fully installed. All right, our electrician and our plumber have made all of their final connections. So let's check out the unit to see how everything's coming together. Now, first and foremost, before my electrician made any connections, we verified that the power that's supplying the unit was in the off position. Next, we're installing the optional auto drain at the bottom here. So we made sure those electrical wires run inside of this conduit, through the bottom knockout of my generator unit, and then connecting to the 2 lugs on the circuit board here. Also, on the back of that auto drain, now that everything's connected, we verified that that handle is in the closed position. Once that was done, we got our control cable, running it down through one of the knockouts on the back of the steam generator using a stress relief clip, and then we connect it to the control board in any of these 3 ports. And it doesn't matter which one you choose, they're all gonna function exactly the same. Once that was complete, we moved on to connecting our main power to the unit through this large conduit here, running through the top knockout, and then connecting the ground and the 2 power wires to their respective lugs on the inside of the steam generator. After that, we moved on to connecting our water line coming out from the supply on the wall into the input on our steam generator here. We've also connected our steam pipe, and again, using that union we talked about earlier, just in case we ever have to remove the unit. And also we've added a little bit of additional piping here for my pressure relief valve drain, making sure that it's draining into either my drain pan or into the floor drain itself. Now the important thing to remember about this drain is that we did make sure that there's an air gap between the bottom of the pipe and the top level of whatever it's draining into. That air gap distance needs to be at least double the diameter of the pipe. So in this instance, this is a 3/4 inch copper pipe, so I need to make sure that distance between the bottom of the pipe and the top level of my drain pan here is at least 1.5 inches. We've also installed the optional auto drain, so I had my plumber add a little bit of an elbow here, making sure that any water that runs through the auto drain is directed into my floor drain. And again, just like my pressure relief valve, this does require an air gap. However, this time, this pipe is only 1/2 of an inch, so that air gap needs to be at least 1 inch in distance. And finally, I also had my plumber add a little bit of an elbow to the end of my drain pan here, ensuring that any water that does collect in the pan is directed directly into my floor drain. However, one note here is making sure that there's no air gap requirement for this drain. Okay, everything here is looking great, so I'm gonna go ahead and reapply my cover panel to my steam generator, and then we can move back inside the shower to go ahead and install my steam head and also the control panel. Here we are at the location that we'll be installing our steam head inside of our shower enclosure. Now, what we're gonna be doing next is dry fitting our steam head onto our steam pipe. However, there's a few things I wanna mention about the pipe before we get to that. First, we wanna confirm that our steam pipe is either copper or brass. Next, I wanna make sure my tile installer has kept the hole around the pipe as tight as possible, confirming that there's no gap between the pipe and the edge of the tile of greater than, say, about 1/2 inch. And finally, I need to confirm that the threaded end of my pipe is sticking out from my finished wall somewhere between 1/4 to 1/2 inches. Okay, once everything looks good, we can move on to dry fitting our steam head onto the pipe. So the first thing I want to do is apply sealant or pipe tape to the threads of the pipe that I'm going to be using for my steam head. Now I think it's a good idea to go ahead and add the pipe sealant or tape at this step, even though it's a dry fit, because that way we can mimic the exact conditions we'll have when we install the steam head for the final time. So I'm going to take my pipe tape, wrap it around the threads. I'm going to go in a clockwise direction since that's the way that the steam head tightens onto the pipe itself. I'm also making sure that I'm not having the tape cover the opening of the pipe in any way. All right, that looks great. Now for the steam head, you'll notice there's 2 parts to the steam head. There's the back portion that sits tight against the finished wall, and then the steam head itself that has a threaded hub on the inside. So I'm gonna start with my back plate, holding it against the wall over the pipe, and then threading my steam head onto the pipe itself, gently making sure I'm not cross-threading this at all. Now one thing you'll notice as I tighten this to the wall is that I'm not using any tools. We wanna make sure we're not using any pliers or wrenches or anything similar in this step, because really everything should be able to be done by hand, and we don't want to over tighten things or cause any damage to the finish of our steam head itself. Okay, so I've got that hand tight to the wall, and there's a few things I'm going to double check to make sure I'm happy with everything, how it's come together. First and foremost, I want to make sure that my back plate is sitting tight against my finished wall. Secondly, I'm also going to check my essential oil reserve, making sure it's facing straight up on the top of my steam head. And lastly, I also want to think about how I want steam to enter my shower enclosure. Now the default setup for this steam head is that steam's going to come out all sides of my steam head, top, bottom, left, and right. However, for your installation, if you decided you want to deflect that steam in a certain direction, there's a plate you can add in just a step or 2 later from here that I'll be sure to talk through with you then. Finally, if when you hand tighten your steam head, if you weren't able to get that essential oil reserve in the correct orientation, there is a way to adjust the threads on the back of the steam head that I'll walk through as well in just a second. Okay, if everything looks good, we can go ahead and spin off this steam head and move on to the final installation. All right, now that I have the steam head off again, I'm gonna talk through first changing the threads on the hub on the back of the steam head. Now you'll notice there's 3 screws that hold this threaded hub onto the back of the steam head itself. Now again, if you didn't like the orientation of that essential oil reserve, we can remove those 3 screws, rotate the hub 120 degrees either to the left or the right, reapply the screws, and then when you go back to your pipe and thread it on, you should have better luck about getting the correct orientation and confirming that the steam head is snug. Also, if you do want to deflect the flow of steam into the enclosure, your steam head ships with one of these deflector plates and 2 little screws, and you can just block off that specific direction on the steam head, making sure steam flows out through the other directions. Now, if you really want to have full control over how the steam comes out, you decide you want to add 1 or even 2 more diverter plates to the head, you certainly can do that. So just be sure to contact Delta's customer service team. They'll be more than happy to help. Okay, once everything looks great, I'm gonna come back to my pipe, remove any sealant or tape I may have on the thread still, and then we'll move on to finally installing the steam head. So I've gone ahead and removed any old tape that I had from the dry fit phase and given myself a new fresh coat of tape around those threads. Next, the first step is going to be applying a bead of sealant to the back side of my wall plate. That's the side that's going to come in contact with my finished enclosure surface. I'm going to use a bead of silicone sealant, and this comes included with the pack for my control panel that we'll install in just a second. So go ahead and pull the top off. I'm going to add just a bead continuously all the way around the rim of my back plate here. Next, I'm going to place my back plate over my pipe, trying to keep it as centered as possible, tight against the wall, followed by my steam head, threading it on the pipe again, just like we did during the dry fit phase. Again, not using any tools, just hand snug against the wall itself. All right, now just like in the dry fit phase, I want to check my final alignment, confirming that my essential oil reserve is facing straight up and that my back plate is tight against the finished wall of my shower enclosure. And that about wraps things up. The last step would be to clean up any of the silicone sealant that may have squeezed out while I was tightening everything down, and then give this ample time to dry before I use the steam head. As a final note, the steam head will become hot while it's in use. So if you're worried about the potential for incidental contact, it does ship with a silicone cover that you can apply over the steam head itself, which will offer just an additional layer of protection. All right, with this all wrapped up, we can move up to installing our control panel. Here we are at the location that will be installing our control panel at the location we determined during the rough framing phase. Now you'll notice that I've drilled a 1.5 inch hole in my tile here and also fished my control cable that's connected to my steam generator all the way through the conduit and then out through my hole. So the first step is using my coupler and connecting one end of the coupler into the control cable. It doesn't matter which one. I just want to make sure I hear a snap when it clicks into place. And then I'm going to take the wire coming out the back of my control panel and snap it into the other end of the coupler. Once I have both of those in there, I want to verify I have a nice tight connection. Now at this point, before I move on to securing the control panel to my enclosure wall, I think it's a great idea to go ahead and test it to ensure the whole system has functionality before we attach it to the wall itself. So at this point, I'm going to take a second to reestablish power to my steam generator, as well as turn on the water supply, give it a couple minutes to boot up fully, and then come back here and we're going to test our control panel. All right, so I gave my steam generator a couple minutes to boot up, so now we can test our control panel. To do this, I'm going to hit the number 1, which looks great. Just want to verify that when I hit the up arrow, I'm getting my temperature adjustment. And then if I hit the 3 lines, it switches over to my timer. All right, everything's looking great. So I want to go ahead and shut my control panel back off now. And then we can move on to securing it to the wall. So to do this, I'm going to flip my control panel over and peel off this adhesive backing on the back of the panel itself. I have to rip it in half to get it off on the cable. Set that off to the side. Now the next thing I want to do is use the included silicone sealant to add a thin bead of sealant all the way around the outside edge of my control panel. What this will do is to help ensure a watertight seal when I press this into place on my enclosure wall. So I'm going to use my silicone sealant here and apply a bead all the way around the outer edge of the control panel. Now with that sealant on there, I'm going to carefully feed my wires back inside the wall. And then I like to get right down in front of my control panel to ensure I'm lining it up perfectly. And before I press it against the wall, make sure it looks level and then give it a little bit of pressure. Okay, now I've got that put into place, so that about wraps things up. The last step is to go ahead and use a clean rag to clean up any of that silicone sealant that may have squeezed out from behind the control panel when I pressed it against the wall. And also be sure to give this plenty of time to fully cure before using your shower or your steam shower. Once that's done, that about wraps up the install of the control panel. All right, with all those connections made, we can go ahead and reestablish power to our steam generator, turn on our water supply, and then double check to make sure it looks like everything's functioning correctly. Now keep in mind, if you need any additional help with the operation of your control panel, be sure to check out the separate video we have for that. Also, if you have any additional questions at all, you can always reach out to the Delta Faucet customer service team. They're more than happy to help.